Welcome back to another episode of the About Mansfield Consumer Advice Series. I'm Steve Casillo, and to my right, that would be your left, this is Dr. Joseph Adams. He's with Calibration Chiropractic and Functional Health. Welcome back.
Excited to be here.
We just wrapped up the series on migraine headaches, and now we're moving into a new topic today. We're starting with concussions.
Yep.
And let's just jump into really concussion 101. What is a concussion?
Yep. So concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. So, the mild portion being that, you didn't get, a skull fracture or, a brain bleed, but you did have trauma to your head and neck, usually an external force, where there is a whiplash type of injury to the head and neck, and that causes the brain to move forward and backward at a rapid pace. And that, movement of the brain is what can cause what's called diffuse axonal shearing. So what it does is it kind of puts tension on the nerves, in the brain, and the cranial nerves that go like to the eyes, the mouth, and, all the other different cranial nerves. And so when people get concussions, there is a neurological impairment that goes along with the physical symptoms of the trauma. And so, a good way to summarize is that, you hit your head, or maybe you didn't, you just moved your neck really at a high speed. And because of that, there are neurological deficits that you will have. And those can last for a short period of time or a long period of time. When I think of a concussion, it's always watching football, and the player goes into concussion protocol, et cetera, et cetera. But so in my mind, it's NFL players who get concussions most. But you're the expert. Who suffers from concussions the most? So athletes, and you definitely spot on about athletics, and it's mostly actually adolescents.
Adolescents, wow.
Adolescent athletes that get concussions the most, and one of those is definitely football players. Mm-hmm. We've taken care of a good amount of high school age football players that have been concussed. Also, soccer is another one that's very common, and for some reason, women's soccer seems to be worse than men's soccer. Huh. It's something maybe to do with just like the aggression, it's a women's soccer.
Does the bouncing of the ball off your forehead over several times, would that lead to a concussion? It's
possible that it could. Now, I'm not sure if there's been, a lot of studies on that, but the correlation that I could see with that is that, you take a female soccer player, and females usually have less muscle mass than males, less muscle mass in the neck especially, and the traps. And so that would set you up to get a concussion, because one of the things that we've realized in the research is that the stronger your neck is, the less likely you're going to get a concussion, because it, provides a base of support for the neck, so the neck doesn't move as much. And so, theoretically, if you have a female player, doing a lot of reps of like headers, that could cause a concussion, or, damage to a degree. A lot of times it's contact, they run into another player, they hit the ground. So there's a lot of different ways, but definitely the biggest population is young athletes. And it's also really sad that it is, young athletes, because a lot of times I think their symptoms aren't taken, as seriously. And sometimes, the amount of workload on some of these athletes is high.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because they're, they have all these practices, all this school.
Select leagues now has become where, the competition gets really fierce. And that's when practices become a little more difficult. And so back to the adolescents then, not only in sports, but are there other ways that the adolescents are suffering from concussions?
So, one of the things that we see most of, in our clinic is people have long-standing symptoms, right?
Yeah.
So, because like most people do get over concussions within a short period of time, and I think we'll chat about that. But a lot of times, unfortunately, these adolescents that are concussed, the protocols that are put forth by the school districts aren't really up to par. because they're looking a lot of times at just cognitive abilities. And so a lot of times the school districts have a protocol of doing an impact test, which an impact test is a cognitive impairment test that they take on a computer. And that's just one of the factors that's affected from a concussion. But they don't look at, like, is this person having, migraine headaches like every day, or dizziness, or, neck pain, balance issues, metabolic problems like GI issues, hormonal issues. And so it tends to plague them more than it should, because the return to play protocols and a lot of your school district protocols aren't really comprehensive enough. And so I think that's one of the reasons we see a lot more damage in that age than there needs to be.
Let's say that I've bumped my head. Maybe I've got a little dizziness, but I don't know if I have a concussion or if I do. What are the symptoms that I should be looking for to determine whether I have a concussion or not?
Yeah, so the symptoms of a concussion are pretty widespread. There's a lot of them. But then one thing that I would say is the number one commonality that they all seem to have is headaches. So, chronic daily headaches, no matter, how painful they are, if you're having headaches after an event that maybe caused a concussion, that's definitely a big red flag and should be one of your first indicators. Another one would be dizziness. And it doesn't have to be like spinning, right? Because a lot of times when people think of vertigo or dizziness, they're thinking spinning. Right. But a lot of times people just feel off. Like they just don't feel like stable, like they don't feel safe walking around. So headaches, dizziness, memory loss is another one. Usually it's more short-term. So people will have, issues with, short-term memory, maybe events, around the concussion, like don't remember things right before it, right after it. We can have a lot of fatigue, visual problems. So like blurred vision, sensitivity to light, sensitivity to sound.
You mentioned a headache or dizziness could last for days. How long does a migraine last? If it's gone, I'm sorry, not a migraine, concussion, how long if it's gone untreated?
So the thing is a lot of times people will heal. Probably 70 to 90% of people heal from a concussion on their own.
Over how long of a time?
Probably 48 hours to 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Somewhere in there.
So it can, a couple of weeks.
Yeah, so it can last a couple of weeks. And so if you have some of those symptoms, let's say after 2 weeks, that should be a real red flag for you.
Oh, sure.
That you may actually be transitioning from acute concussion to what's called post-concussion syndrome, where you basically have the symptoms that you got from the original concussion. They just continue. They don't really get any better. Sometimes they get worse.
And how do you diagnose one?
So diagnosis of concussion is primarily based off of, learning about the history, the symptoms, the history, how it happened, the diagnostic tests that, we would run. And so there's no one smoking, gun type of test that you can say this person's concussed, because if you were to get an MRI on somebody, you're not going to see any changes in the brain, most likely, unless they have a more serious injury. So it's really an invisible disease to the untrained eye. And even some of the, providers that don't specialize in concussion, to them it can be somewhat of an enigma, because concussion is very different for every different person.
Yeah.
And so it's really one of these things you got to, sit down, listen to them, examine them, and determine if this really makes sense as a concussion, and put all those pieces together, and if the probability is high, then that's how you move forward.
What's involved in the exam? My guess is you're looking at eye movement, but what else is going on?
So eye movements are one of the biggest ones, and that's why everybody sees it, looked at on the field like in a football game.
Sure.
Because when you get that concussion, a lot of times you'll shear or stretch the nerves that go to the eyes, and that is what causes the changes in their eye movement motility, and so that's one thing we look at. We look at it bedside, and then we also have a machine that can walk on their eyes in front of cameras and give us some objective data on that. And then the next thing we would do from more of a diagnostic standpoint is look at their balance and their coordination, because those are usually affected too. And so we put people on a balance platform and see how well their balance is. And then we also do coordination tests with them at bedside. And so by looking at eyes, balance, coordination, you can get a pretty good idea if somebody's been concussed.
We are doing this in 10-minute increments, 10-minute nuggets of information, as we like to say. And this is just the beginning of a 5-part series on concussions. Dr. Joe, if someone wanted to reach out to you and find out more information about concussions, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find us at calibrationmansfield.com. You can find us on all social media as well. Just look for Calibration Chiropractic and Functional Health. And we actually have some really good PDFs on the homepage of our website on concussion and some of the more complex stuff that we treat. CalibrationMansfield.com. This is Dr. Joseph Adams. That is another episode of the About Mansfield Consumer Advice Series. Dr. Joe, we'll see you next week. All right, see you, buddy.
We appreciate you listening to the About Mansfield Consumer Advice Series. By the way, if you own a business and you are interested in being a part of the Consumer Advice Series, if you have the knowledge to give information in 10-minute increments to the consumers, shoot me an email to info@aboutmansfield.com. Again, that is info@aboutmansfield.com. We'll tell you how we can get you all set up. Appreciate it. We do it again next week right here on the podcast.